In the third week of January, in the year 1909, a long-dormant case file was opened in the state of New Jersey. It documented a period of 7 days when the veil between folklore and reality grew terrifyingly thin, when a centuries-old legend stepped out of the whispered tales of the Pine Barrens and into the gaslit streets of the modern world. For 1 week, the constabulary forces of a modern American state would find themselves hunting a creature that, by all rational accounts, could not exist. The official record is one of mass hysteria. The unofficial one, buried in police ledgers and frightened testimony, suggests something else entirely. If you are drawn to the shadows where history and mystery converge, and this is your first time in our archive, consider subscribing. Our work is to ensure the stories that have been forgotten are never truly lost. The event did not begin with a scream, but with a quiet, unsettling discovery in the snow. It was a Tuesday, the 16th of January, and the Pine Barrens were held in the deepest grip of winter. A profound stillness lay over the landscape, the dense stands of pitch, pine, and oak burdened with a fresh layer of white, their branches transformed into a brittle, crystalline lattice. The air was thin and sharp, so cold it felt as a physical presence against the skin, and the only sound was the faint, percussive crunch of a man's boots breaking the frozen crust of the earth. He was a local woodsman, a man whose life was written in the language of the forest, who understood its rhythms and its secrets as intimately as he knew the lines on his own hands. He was checking his trap lines near the town of Woodbury, a routine he had performed without incident for more than 2 decades. It was this deep familiarity that allowed him to notice the anomaly almost immediately. There, pressed deep into the otherwise untouched canvas of the snow, was a set of tracks. They were not the familiar prints of a deer, a fox, or any of the other creatures whose lives he shared in this isolated wilderness. His first emotion was not fear, but a profound and academic curiosity. He knelt, his gloved fingers tracing the air just above the impression, his breath pluming in the frigid morning. The prints were cloven, like those of a deer or a sheep, yet they were impossibly large, each one nearly the size of his own hand. But it was the gait, the pattern of their placement, that truly disturbed the deep logic of his woodsman's mind. The tracks were bipedal. They moved on 2 legs, one print placed directly and deliberately in front of the other, suggesting a weight and a balance that belonged to no known animal in North America. The stride was long, impossibly long, indicating a creature of considerable height. He followed the trail. It led him from the dense thicket where he first found it, across a small, frozen creek, and toward the sparse cluster of farmhouses on the edge of the barrens. The path the creature had taken was unnervingly direct, not meandering or foraging as a wild animal would, but purposeful, as if it were traveling with a specific destination in mind. It crossed a cleared field, the strange cloven footprints a stark and alien calligraphy against the white expanse. Then, he saw where the trail led next, and the professional curiosity curdled into a cold knot of dread in his stomach. The tracks went directly to the back of a small farmhouse, a home belonging to a family he knew. They did not circle the property. They did not stop at the door. They went straight to the wall of the house, and then they vanished. There were no corresponding prints leading away, no sign of a struggle, no disturbance in the snow other than the final 2 cloven marks pressed deep against the foundation stones. It was as if the creature that made them had simply ceased to exist upon reaching the wooden siding of the home. The woodsman stood there for a long time, the silence of the pines pressing in on him, his mind struggling to reconcile the evidence before his eyes with the rigid laws of the physical world. He had seen something that could not be, and the knowledge of it felt like a violation. After a few more minutes of frozen indecision, he turned and walked, not ran, back toward the town. He needed to tell the police. In Burlington County, Sergeant James Mason was a man who believed in the tangible world. He was a career officer, a man defined by procedure, evidence, and the rational progression of cause and effect. His world was one of handwritten reports, telegraph messages, and the reassuring weight of his service revolver at his hip. Superstition was a luxury for children and the uneducated, a relic of a darker, more ignorant time. When the call came in regarding strange tracks found in the snow, his initial reaction was one of professional annoyance. It was the middle of a bitter winter, a time when isolation and cabin fever could play tricks on the mind. He expected to find the tracks of a misshapen deer, or perhaps a clever hoax perpetrated by local youths with too much time on their hands. He dispatched a junior officer, a young man still new to the force, with instructions to placate the resident and file a cursory report. It was an exercise in community relations, nothing more. An hour later, the junior officer returned. He was a robust and typically unflappable young man, but when he entered Sergeant Mason's small, steam-heated office, his face was pale and his usual confidence was gone. He did not offer a simple explanation. Instead, he spoke with a quiet, unnerved urgency, describing the prints with a level of detail that Mason found unsettling. The young officer insisted that Mason see them for himself. There was a sincerity in the man's voice, a tremor of genuine fear that cut through Mason's practiced skepticism. Against his better judgment, he pulled on his heavy wool coat and went out into the biting cold, his mind already formulating the logical explanations he would need to restore order. The woodsman, the initial witness, was waiting for them, his expression grim. He led them back to the farmhouse, the scene of the strange disappearance. Sergeant Mason knelt in the snow, just as the woodsman had done. He saw what the younger officer had tried and failed to adequately describe: the cloven prints, the bipedal stride, the impossible vanishing point at the wall of the house. He ran a gloved hand over the wooden siding, searching for any scuff marks, any indication that something had climbed the wall, but he found nothing. The wood was smooth, undisturbed. The snow on the low-sloping roof above was a perfect, unbroken sheet. He stood up, a deep furrow in his brow. The evidence before him presented a direct challenge to his entire worldview. Tracks do not simply stop. Creatures do not simply vanish. He instructed his officer to begin a more thorough search of the area, to look for any other signs, any piece of data that could bring this anomaly back into the realm of the explainable. It was then that a second call came, a frantic report from a neighboring town, 5 miles to the east. More tracks had been found. This new location was a small, residential street in the town of Bristol, a place far removed from the primal wilderness of the Pine Barrens. Here, the tracks told an even more impossible story. They appeared in the middle of a snow-covered road, as if the creature had dropped from the sky. They proceeded down the street, then mounted the curb and crossed the front lawn of a 2-story home. Then, they climbed onto the porch roof. Sergeant Mason and his officer arrived to find a small crowd of residents huddled together on the street, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief, pointing up at the roof. The sergeant had to see for himself. He and the junior officer used a ladder borrowed from a nervous neighbor to climb onto the slick, frost-covered shingles. And there they were, the same cloven prints, pressed into the thin layer of snow, marching in a straight line directly across the peak of the roof. The sight was profoundly unnerving. The echo of hooves on frozen rooftops was a sound that belonged to mythology, not to a Tuesday morning in southern New Jersey. They followed the trail. It crossed from that roof to the roof of the adjacent house, clearing a 10-foot gap with no sign of a leap or a stumble. The prints were as clear and deliberate on the second roof as they had been on the first. They followed this impossible path over 3 more houses, a silent rooftop journey through the heart of a sleeping town. On the fifth and final house, the tracks led to the edge of the roof, and then they stopped. Below, in the snow of the backyard, there was nothing. No landing prints, no disturbance. Just an empty expanse of white. The creature had walked across the rooftops of a town and then, as if it had been lifted by unseen wires, it had ascended into the cold, gray sky. Sergeant Mason stood on that rooftop for a long time, the winter wind whipping at his coat. He looked down at the street, at the growing crowd of upturned faces, and he felt a sense of profound unease that had nothing to do with the precarious height. The rules of his world were being systematically dismantled. The evidence was irrefutable, yet what it implied was impossible. As a police officer, his duty was to protect the public from tangible threats: thieves, drunks, men driven by greed or passion. But what was he supposed to do with this? How do you pursue a suspect that leaves no trail? A creature that defies the very laws of physics. A cold dread, far more penetrating than the January air, began to settle in his bones. He knew, with a certainty that he could not explain, that this was only the beginning. He was no longer investigating a prank. He was investigating a presence. By that evening, the story had reached the newspapers. In the beginning, it was treated as a piece of local color, a quaint and curious story from the rural counties to fill a small space on an inside page. The initial headlines were skeptical, even faintly mocking, framing the events as a classic example of small-town superstition. Editors in the bustling modern cities of Camden and Philadelphia saw it as a throwback, a tale from the dark, uneducated interior of the state, a place still haunted by old legends and folk tales. The name itself, whispered at first by the older residents who had heard the stories from their grandparents, began to find its way into the reports. The Leeds Devil. For 2 centuries, the legend had been a fixture of the Pine Barrens, the story of a cursed 13th child born to a woman named Deborah Leeds in the year 1735. The tale claimed the child was born a monster, with the head of a horse, the wings of a bat, and a forked tail, a creature that had escaped into the pines and haunted them ever since. It was a story told around fireplaces on cold nights, a piece of Gothic folklore used to frighten children. It was not something that a serious 20th century newspaper would ever report as fact. But as the night of January 16th deepened, the calls began to multiply. The telegraph wires started humming with reports from towns all across the region. It was no longer confined to the isolated edges of the Pine Barrens. Tracks were being reported in Moorestown, in Haddonfield, in Riverside. The descriptions were all eerily consistent: cloven, bipedal prints that appeared in inexplicable locations and vanished without a trace. The sheer volume of the reports began to change the tone of the coverage. The initial skepticism in the newsroom started to give way to a cautious and then a fervent curiosity. This was no longer a single, isolated incident. It was a pattern. Something was moving through southern New Jersey, and its path was being meticulously documented by dozens of independent, terrified witnesses. The fear was contagious, spreading faster than any official explanation could contain it. What began as a local curiosity was rapidly metastasizing into a regional panic. The telephone, still a relatively new technology, became an instrument of terror, carrying panicked voices from one town to the next. Families locked their doors, peering out through frosted windows into the encroaching darkness, every shadow taking on a menacing new shape. The sound of the wind whistling through the pines was no longer a familiar comfort, but a potential sign of something monstrous taking flight. The sightings began to escalate from mere tracks to fleeting, terrifying glimpses of the creature itself. A farmer returning from his barn reported seeing a tall, dark shape with glowing red eyes at the edge of his property. A woman claimed to have heard a high-pitched, unearthly scream just outside her home, a sound she said was like nothing she had ever heard from man or beast. In his office, Sergeant Mason found himself at the epicenter of a storm he could not control. His desk was littered with telegrams and hastily scribbled notes, each one documenting a new piece of an impossible puzzle. The map on his wall, once a simple grid of towns and roads, was now dotted with pins, each one marking a new sighting, a new set of tracks. The pins formed a clear, eastward trajectory, a line of movement heading from the dark heart of the Pine Barrens directly toward the densely populated city of Camden. The initial reports had been strange. These new ones were becoming overtly hostile. A trolley conductor just outside of Haddon Heights reported that something large and winged had swooped down at his vehicle, its claws scraping audibly along the metal roof. The passengers, he reported, had thrown themselves to the floor in panic. The story was accelerating, evolving from a mystery into a direct threat. The core question that had haunted Sergeant Mason all day, the question of whether this creature could possibly be the same one from the colonial Leeds Devil legend, was being supplanted by a far more urgent and terrifying one. If it was real, and it was moving toward the cities, what was it going to do when it got there? The transition was complete. A local fear had become a regional hysteria, and the strange tracks in the snow were now leading authorities toward a confrontation they were utterly unprepared for. The hunt had begun. The morning of Wednesday, the 17th of January, dawned cold and unforgiving. The weak winter sun did little to dispel the profound chill that had settled over the towns of southern New Jersey, a chill that now felt deeper than the frost on the window panes. The events of the previous day had transformed the region. What had been a collection of quiet, self-contained communities was now a network of shared and escalating fear. The stories of the impossible tracks had traveled through the night, carried by telegraph and telephone, and by the oldest method of all, the hushed, urgent tones of human gossip. The light of day did not bring clarity or relief. It only served to illuminate the evidence of the night's passage, and in doing so, it dragged the communal nightmare into the harsh reality of the waking world. Hysteria, it turns out, does not sleep. Sergeant James Mason had not slept either. He had spent the night in his office, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and cigar smoke, trying to impose the rigid structure of a police investigation onto a series of events that seemed to actively mock the very concept of order. The map on his wall was now a spiderweb of pins and penciled notations, a graphic representation of the creature's inexplicable journey. It showed a path that defied all known principles of animal behavior and, more disturbingly, the laws of physics. His training had prepared him for the predictable violence of men, but it had offered no protocol for this. He was a cartographer of chaos, and he knew, with a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, that his work was far from over. With the arrival of dawn came the decision to formalize the evidence. Sergeant Mason commissioned a photographer from Camden, a man more accustomed to taking stiff family portraits than documenting the paranormal. The man arrived with his cumbersome equipment, a large format view camera, a heavy wooden tripod, and a case of fragile glass plate negatives. He was a professional, a man of science and optics, and his initial demeanor was one of detached amusement. He clearly believed he was being called upon to debunk a local hoax. Sergeant Mason led him to one of the most well-preserved sites, the backyard of a home in the town of Gloucester City. A crowd had already gathered, held back by a pair of young, nervous constables. The townspeople stood in a silent, fearful semicircle, their breath misting in the frigid air, their eyes fixed on the strange marks in the snow as if they were the scene of a brutal crime. The photographer's amusement evaporated the moment he saw the prints. He said nothing, but his posture changed. The casual professionalism was replaced by a focused, almost clinical intensity. He knelt, his face close to the impressions, and Sergeant Mason could see the dawning of a profound cognitive dissonance in the man's eyes. He had come to expose a fraud, but he was now faced with physical evidence that his rational mind could not process. The process of documenting the tracks was slow and methodical. The photographer carefully set up his tripod, his movements precise and deliberate in the biting cold. He ducked under the black cloth, adjusting the focus with painstaking care. The crowd watched in complete silence, the only sound the click and whir of the camera's mechanical shutter. For each photograph, a small pan of magnesium powder was ignited, producing a brilliant, blinding flash of white light that momentarily bleached the gray morning, followed by a puff of acrid smoke. It felt less like a police procedure, and more like a strange quasi-scientific ritual, an attempt to capture an apparition on a photographic plate. They documented everything. They photographed the prints from multiple angles. They placed a ruler next to them for scale. The stark black inch marks a testament to the scientific method being applied to the unbelievable. The cloven shape, the sheer size, the unnerving bipedal gait, it was all captured in stark, silver nitrate reality. But the most important photographs were of the trackways themselves, the narrative they told. They documented a line of prints that led directly to a 5-foot-high wrought iron fence. There were no signs of hesitation, no scuff marks on the snow-dusted metal, no disturbed earth on the other side indicating a heavy landing. The tracks simply stopped at the fence on one side and resumed on the other, the stride and spacing completely unchanged. It was as if the fence had not been there at all. Then, they moved to another location, a brick warehouse on the edge of town, where a different set of tracks had been reported. Here, the story was even more baffling. The cloven prints walked directly to the center of a solid brick wall, and then they ended. There was no snow on the roof above, no footprints leading away, just a final, definitive pair of impressions pressed into the frozen ground. The tracks led, quite literally, to nowhere. The photographer packed his equipment in silence, his earlier skepticism replaced by a quiet, shaken sobriety. He informed Sergeant Mason that the plates would be developed by the evening. There was now an official, empirical record of the impossible. While the police attempted to grapple with the physical evidence, the psychological impact of the phenomenon was beginning to tear at the social fabric of the affected towns. The fear was most acute among the children. They had absorbed the panic of their parents, the whispered stories of a monster in the dark, and their imaginations had done the rest. On the morning of January 17th, a silent rebellion took place in households across Burlington and Camden counties. Children, who normally would have been bundled in coats and sent off on their daily walk to school, refused to leave their homes. They wept, they pleaded, they hid under their beds. They were gripped by a genuine and unshakable terror of what might be waiting for them outside the supposed safety of their own four walls. The result was unprecedented. In the town of Collingswood, the school teacher, a stern but respected woman who had managed classrooms for 30 years, stood at the entrance to the local schoolhouse, ringing the morning bell into an empty, snow-covered schoolyard. Not a single student appeared. She would later report that the silence was the most unnerving sound she had ever experienced. By mid-morning, the situation was repeating itself across the region. School boards in Haddonfield, Morristown, and Bristol convened emergency meetings. Faced with empty classrooms and frantic calls from parents, they made a decision that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. They officially closed the schools. The announcement, posted on public bulletin boards and spread by word of mouth, was a profound and terrifying admission. It was a declaration that the institutions of society, the very structures of normal life, were surrendering to a legend. The fear had become more powerful than the need for education, more real than the daily routines that held their world together. The closing of the schools sent a new wave of panic through the population. If the authorities were so frightened that they were sending the children home, then the threat must be real. The invisible creature had achieved what no storm or sickness had in recent memory. It had brought civilization to a standstill. The rising paranoia was not confined to the schoolyards. It began to infect every aspect of public life. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. A strange noise in the night was no longer the wind, but a potential visitation. The local journalists, who had initially treated the story with a degree of condescension, now found themselves at the center of a national sensation. Telegraphs poured into their small offices from newspapers in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, all demanding more information, more eyewitness accounts. The story of the Jersey Devil was becoming front-page news. The local reporters, some of them young men who had never covered anything more dramatic than a town council meeting, were now thrust into the role of chroniclers of a mass panic. They found themselves documenting a world that seemed to be unraveling, interviewing people whose terror was palpable and utterly sincere. Their articles, filled with breathless, first-hand accounts and speculative theories, were printed and sent out on the evening trains, fanning the flames of the hysteria even further. It was in this atmosphere of heightened fear that the first truly terrifying encounter occurred. The incident did not happen in the dead of night, but in the flat, gray light of mid-afternoon. A mail carrier, a man known for his reliability and his sober disposition, was making his rural delivery route near the town of Mount Holly. His path took him along a long, lonely stretch of road, flanked on both sides by dense, snow-laden woods. The world was quiet, the rhythmic clopping of his horse's hooves and the gentle creak of the mail wagon the only sounds to break the stillness. The horse, a steady and placid animal that had walked this route for years, suddenly stopped. Its head shot up, its ears flattened against its skull, and a low, guttural whinny of distress rumbled in its chest. The mail carrier, annoyed at the interruption, urged the animal forward, but the horse refused to move. It stood rigid in the traces, its entire body trembling, its eyes wide with a terror the man could not comprehend. He looked up, scanning the road ahead, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. He looked to the woods on either side, the dark pines offering no clues. And then he heard it. A sound, he would later report, like the rustling of 1,000 dry leaves, coming from somewhere above him. He tilted his head back, his gaze directed toward the overcast winter sky. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, a shape blotted out the gray light. It was not a bird. It was too large, its form too angular and wrong. He had the distinct impression of vast, leathery wings, a long serpentine neck, and a head that was unnervingly equine. It was a fleeting silhouette, a momentary eclipse of the sky, but it was enough. The creature let out a cry, a piercing, high-frequency shriek that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the mail carrier's skull. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated malice. The horse's reaction was instantaneous and violent. It reared up, its eyes rolling back in their sockets, and let out a scream of its own, a sound of such primal terror that the mail carrier would hear it in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The animal thrashed in its harness, its powerful legs kicking wildly. Before its strength gave out entirely, it collapsed in the snow, its body convulsing, foam frothing from its mouth. The mail carrier was thrown from his seat, landing hard in a snowdrift. When he scrambled to his feet, his mind reeling, the thing in the sky was gone. There was only the unnatural silence, his own ragged breathing, and the pathetic, whimpering sounds of his dying horse. He was found an hour later by a passing farmer, a man wandering the road in a state of profound shock, unable to speak, pointing a trembling finger toward the sky. The news of the mail carrier's encounter marked a critical turning point. The physical evidence of the tracks had been unsettling, a logical paradox that created a deep intellectual unease. This was different. This was an attack. The creature was no longer a passive, mysterious traveler. It was an active, aggressive presence, capable of inspiring a terror so profound it could literally stop an animal's heart. The investigation had now irrevocably shifted. The police were no longer just tracking a mystery. They were now hunting something that was a clear and present danger to the public. The progression from strange evidence to direct, terrifying encounters was complete. As the sun began to set on the 17th of January, casting long, distorted shadows across the snow, a sense of collective dread descended. Night was falling, and for the first time, the people of New Jersey had to confront the terrifying possibility that the thing with wings would not simply pass them by in the darkness. It might, instead, come down from the sky. The chaos was moving from the quiet countryside and into the industrial heart of the state, and no one knew where it would strike next. The darkness that fell on the evening of Wednesday, January 17th, was of a different quality than the one that had preceded it. It was no longer a simple absence of light, a familiar condition of the winter world. It was now a presence, a canvas upon which a collective terror was beginning to project its most primal fears. The stories of the mail carrier's dead horse and the shuttered schools had seeped into the public consciousness, and the quiet dread of the previous night had curdled into a sharp, active paranoia. The creature, or the idea of it, had followed the tracks east, leaving the primeval stillness of the Pine Barrens behind. It was now approaching the domain of man, the sprawling, gaslit, industrial labyrinth of Camden. Here, in the city of foundries and factories, of crowded tenements and the ceaseless grinding of machinery, the legend would collide with the 20th century in a terrifying and spectacular fashion. The city of Camden in 1909 was a place of stark contrasts. It was a beacon of American industry, its air thick with the smell of coal, smoke, and progress, the night sky perpetually hazed by the orange glow of its blast furnaces. But beneath this veneer of modernity, it was a city of deep shadows, of narrow cobblestone streets and alleys that the new electric lights had not yet managed to conquer. It was a place where thousands of people lived packed together, their lives governed by the shriek of the factory whistle and the clatter of the trolley car. It was into this world, a world that believed it had banished the monsters of the old one, that the entity now descended. The first urban attack came shortly after 9 o'clock that evening. It targeted a trolley car on the Federal Street line, a rattling, brightly lit capsule of humanity making its way through the darkened city. Inside, the atmosphere was mundane, the passengers lulled by the familiar rhythm of the journey. They were factory workers heading home from a late shift, their faces smudged with soot and fatigue. There were women with shopping parcels, and a few men reading the evening papers, the headlines now dominated by the very creature whose existence they were about to have confirmed. The trolley swayed on its tracks, its bell clanging intermittently at intersections, the sparks from its overhead electrical contact showering the wet street below like fleeting, incandescent sprites. It was a scene of absolute, unremarkable normalcy. And then, that normalcy was shattered. It began with a sound from above. It was not the familiar drumming of winter rain or the scrape of a low-hanging tree branch. It was a heavy, percussive thudding against the thin metal roof of the car, as if a great weight had suddenly landed upon it. The passengers looked up from their newspapers, their conversations trailing off into an uneasy silence. The conductor, a veteran of the line named Jacob Miller, who had seen his share of street brawls and mechanical failures, felt a jolt run through the entire frame of the vehicle. He slowed the trolley, peering out into the darkness, assuming a piece of equipment had come loose. Then came a second sound, a horrifying, drawn-out scraping, like giant claws being dragged slowly and deliberately across the roof. Panic, cold and electric, flashed through the car. A woman at the back of the car let out a short, sharp scream. The passengers scrambled back from the windows, their faces pale in the flickering gaslight of the car's interior. The thudding began again, louder this time, more violent, and it was accompanied by a new sound, a low, guttural hissing that was audible even over the hum of the electric motors. It was a sound of reptilian fury, a vocalization that belonged to no known mammal or bird. The entire trolley car began to rock on its tracks, not from its own motion, but from the force of the thing that was now moving upon its roof. The conductor would later tell the police that he saw something long and dark lash down past his window, something that looked like a leathery wing. For nearly a full minute, which felt to those inside like an eternity, the assault continued. The unseen creature beat its wings against the roof, the sound like a great wet blanket being slammed against the metal over and over. It shrieked, a high, piercing cry that seemed to cut through the very soul of everyone who heard it. Passengers were now huddled on the floor, some weeping, others praying. The conductor, his face ashen, did the only thing he could think to do. He threw the electric motor into full power. The trolley lurched forward, sparks flying from the overhead line as it surged down the tracks at a dangerous speed. The creature on the roof seemed to be startled by the sudden acceleration. The passengers felt a final, violent shudder, and then the weight was gone. The conductor did not stop the trolley until he reached the next brightly lit station, where the car disgorged its terrified occupants onto the platform. They stood there, trembling and incoherent, pointing back into the darkness, their story so fantastic that the station master initially believed them to be drunk, but their terror was too genuine, too profound to be dismissed. And on the roof of the trolley car, clearly visible under the station lights, were a series of long, deep gouges in the metal, marks that no tree branch could ever have made. The news of the trolley attack spread through the city with the speed of a telegraph wire, but before the full import of that event could be absorbed, the second, and far more public, encounter took place. It happened less than an hour later at the Pennsylvania Railroad's Ferry House, a massive, sprawling industrial complex on the Camden waterfront. The night shift was in full operation, the air filled with the clang of hammers on steel, the hiss of steam, and the shouts of men. It was a self-contained world of fire and labor. Suddenly, above the din, a new sound emerged, a frantic, panic screaming from the workers on the outer docks. The factory foreman, a large and pragmatic man named Frederick Hogan, ran outside, expecting to find a fire or a terrible industrial accident. What he saw instead brought him to a dead stop. There, perched atop the highest point of the ferry house roof, was a silhouette. It was illuminated from behind by the ambient glow of the city and the furnaces, making its shape clear and undeniable against the dark sky. It was enormous, far larger than any bird. It had a long, thin neck and a head that was distinctly horse-like in its proportions. From its back sprouted a pair of vast, bat-like wings, which it held partially unfurled. And from its head, 2 points of intense, red light shone down on the chaos below, like the embers of a forge. It was not a trick of the light. It was not a shadow. It was a living, breathing creature, and it was looking down at them. The reaction was instantaneous. The ingrained discipline of the workforce dissolved into a primal stampede. Men who wrestled with white-hot metal for a living dropped their tools and fled. They scrambled over piles of equipment and pushed past each other in a desperate, mindless rush to get away, their shouts and cries of terror replacing the familiar sounds of industry. The factory sirens began to wail, not as a signal for a shift change, but as an alarm, their mournful, rising and falling cry echoing out across the Delaware River and into the streets of Philadelphia. The sound added a new, apocalyptic layer to the growing chaos. Within minutes, the first police officers arrived, their revolvers drawn. Among them was Sergeant James Mason's junior officer, the same young man who had been so unnerved by the tracks in the snow just a day before. He saw the creature on the roof, and any lingering hope he had for a rational explanation for these events died in that moment. He and the other officers took up positions in the yard, shouting at the creature, their voices thin and lost in the cacophony of the sirens. The thing on the roof did not move. It simply watched them, its glowing eyes unwavering. An order was given. The officers took aim, and the sharp crack of police revolvers cut through the night. They emptied their weapons at the shape on the roof. Muzzle flashes lit up the terrified faces of the factory workers who had stopped at a safe distance to watch. The bullets whined into the darkness. Several officers would swear that they saw their shots strike home, that they heard the unmistakable impact of lead on flesh. But the creature did not fall. It did not even flinch. After the last shot had been fired, and a tense, ringing silence fell over the yard, the thing on the roof finally moved. It let out the same high-pitched, unearthly shriek that the trolley passengers and the mail carrier had described, a sound that made the officer's blood run cold. Then, with a powerful downstroke of its enormous wings, it launched itself into the night sky. It circled the ferry house once, a great, dark shape against the clouds, and then it flew east, disappearing into the darkness over the city. The events at the trolley and the ferry house were the final dam breaking. The panic was no longer a creeping, insidious thing. It was a flood. The telegraph and telephone lines were completely overwhelmed. Police stations, newspaper offices, and radio broadcasters were inundated with calls. The sightings were no longer isolated or ambiguous. Hundreds of people, from Camden to Trenton and across the river in Philadelphia, claimed to see it. A group of businessmen in Bristol, Pennsylvania, saw it fly over the river, its features clearly visible in the moonlight. A social club in Gloucester City had their meeting thrown into chaos when the creature allegedly landed on their roof and peered into the window. Its description was now chillingly consistent. The head of a horse, the wings of a bat, a long neck, and glowing red eyes. The question of whether the witnesses were feeding on a shared fear, or whether something was truly stalking the skies of New Jersey, was now at the forefront of every conversation. The sheer volume and consistency of the reports from sober, credible, and unrelated individuals made the theory of mass hysteria seem increasingly inadequate. This was a shared, experienced event. The police were now in a state of full mobilization, no longer investigating a mystery, but actively hunting a creature that had attacked public transport, terrorized a major industrial site, and shrugged off their bullets as if they were pebbles. The authorities, from local police chiefs to state officials, were now faced with an undeniable crisis. The fear had reached a fever pitch, and the institutions of the modern world were being forced to confront a nightmare that had clawed its way out of the pages of folklore. The debate was no longer about if they should act, but how. The question of grounding all transport was raised in hushed, frantic meetings. The possibility of calling in soldiers was, for the first time, seriously considered. The state was now on the verge of a complete lockdown, held hostage by a thing with wings. The morning of Thursday, January 18th, brought with it a new and terrifying state of being. The panic of the previous days had been a wildfire, but now it was a conflagration. The state of New Jersey, a proud and modern entity of industry and law, found itself besieged by a ghost from its own colonial past. The rational institutions that formed the bedrock of its society, from commerce and education to law enforcement itself, were beginning to fracture under the immense, collective weight of a fear that could not be reasoned with. The creature, whether real or imagined, had achieved a victory of psychological warfare that no human enemy could have hoped for. It had turned the familiar world into a landscape of dread, and the mechanisms of modern life were grinding to a halt. The state was now officially on alert. The official response was a study in organized desperation. In the state capital of Trenton, and in the sprawling suburbs of Philadelphia that bled across the Delaware River, the day began not with the familiar routines of commerce, but with the grim spectacle of police patrols. These were no longer simple investigations of strange tracks. They were organized hunts. Squads of officers, their faces etched with a mixture of grim determination and barely concealed fear, marched through the silent streets, their shotguns held at the ready. Their presence was meant to be a reassurance to the public, a sign that the authorities were in control. But the effect was the opposite. The sight of armed men actively searching for a monster on the streets of a modern city only served to validate the terror. It was an official endorsement of the nightmare. The shutdowns, which had begun with a few scattered schools, became widespread and absolute. Municipal ordinances were hastily passed. Factory whistles that had dictated the rhythms of daily life for generations remained silent. Great industrial plants in Camden and Newark, the very engines of the state's economy, stood cold and inert, their gates locked, not by labor disputes, but by a shared, paralyzing fear. Thousands of workers, who would normally be stoking furnaces or operating machinery, instead huddled in their homes, barricading their doors against a threat that could supposedly fly. The economic lifeblood of the region was clotting. The fear had become more powerful than the need for a wage. The state, for all its progress and power, was being held hostage by a folktale. The atmosphere was apocalyptic. The telegraph wires, the great neural network of the age, hummed with a constant, frantic energy, transmitting not commercial orders or personal greetings, but rumors, sightings, and official warnings. They were vectors for the contagion of fear, spreading the panic to the farthest corners of the state and beyond. In town after town, church bells began to ring at odd hours. They were not calling the faithful to prayer, but acting as communal alarms, rung by nervous sextons at the slightest provocation. A dark shape in the clouds, a strange cry in the wind. The sound, which for centuries had been a source of comfort and order, was now a tolling for a world that felt as if it were coming undone. The claustrophobia was immense. The devil was everywhere, and it was nowhere, a phantom that existed in the humming wires, the clanging bells, and the terrified whispers of an entire populace. While the cities were paralyzed by a modern, systemic collapse, the fear in the rural areas was taking on a more primal and visceral character. Here, the threat was not to the abstract concepts of commerce or order, but to the tangible realities of livestock and livelihood. Reports began to flood in from the outlying farms, tales of a predator unlike any other. Chickens were found slain in their coops, not simply killed, but torn apart with a savage fury. A farmer's dog, a loyal and fierce animal that had guarded his property for years, was found dead in the yard, its body mangled, but strangely, not eaten. The attacks seemed driven not by hunger, but by a kind of malevolent rage. The creature was not just a terrifying apparition, it was a physical and violent entity. The most chilling of these accounts came from a farmer just south of the town of Pemberton, a man who lived on the very edge of the Pine Barrens, in the heart of the legend's traditional territory. He was a stoic and unflappable individual, a man whose life was a constant struggle against the unforgiving realities of nature. On the night of the 17th, he was awoken by a violent disturbance in his sheep pen. He was no stranger to the threats of the wild, to the dangers of wolves or rabid foxes. He grabbed his 12-gauge shotgun and a single shell, and stepped out into the freezing, moonless night. The sounds from the pen were horrifying. The sheep were bleating in a register of pure terror he had never heard before, a frantic, chaotic symphony of death. As he approached, a shape rose up from among the panicked animals. The farmer would later describe it to the police with a voice devoid of all emotion, as if the shock had burned away his capacity for anything but flat, factual recitation. It was tall, he said, taller than a man. Its body was thin and dark, and its head was long, like a horse's, but it was the eyes that had frozen him where he stood. They glowed with a soft internal red luminescence, like the dying coals of a fire. They were eyes that did not reflect light, but created it. The creature was holding one of his sheep, its limp body held effortlessly in one of its thin, clawed appendages. It looked at the farmer, its head cocked with an air of intelligent curiosity, as if this small, angry human with his metal tube was a mild novelty. The farmer, acting on an instinct that was deeper than fear, raised the shotgun to his shoulder, took aim at the center of the glowing eyes, and fired. The sound of the blast was deafening in the still night air, a violent, man-made thunderclap that rolled out across the frozen fields. The recoil slammed the butt of the gun into his shoulder. For a split second, the world was illuminated by the brilliant orange flash from the muzzle, and in that flash, he saw the creature's form with perfect, terrible clarity. He was certain the shot had struck home. It was a point-blank shot, impossible to miss. He expected the creature to cry out, to fall, to do anything that a living thing does when it is grievously wounded. It did nothing. It simply stood there for a moment in the ringing silence that followed the blast, its red eyes still fixed on him. Then, it dropped the dead sheep, and with a movement that was too fast for the farmer's mind to fully process, it spread its enormous, leathery wings and leaped into the air, disappearing into the blackness above. When the farmer's courage returned, he cautiously approached the spot where the creature had stood. His lantern cast a shaky, yellow circle of light on the snow. There was no body. There was no blood. There was not even a single, stray track to indicate that it had ever been there. There was only the dead sheep, its neck broken, and a strange, circular patch in the snow, roughly 5 feet in diameter. The snow in this circle was not just melted, it was gone. The frozen earth beneath was blackened and scorched, as if a powerful heat had been directed at it. A faint, acrid smell, like burnt sulfur or ozone, hung in the air. The farmer stood over this impossible evidence, the spent shotgun shell still warm in his hand. He had met the devil in his own yard, had shot it with a 12-gauge slug, and all he had to show for it was a patch of scorched earth and the unshakable knowledge that the rules of his world no longer applied. This story, and others like it, became fuel for the true engine of the hysteria, the press. In the newspaper offices of Philadelphia, Trenton, and New York, editors who had initially dismissed the reports as rural fantasy now saw the commercial potential of a legend come to life. The story was moved from the back pages to the front, the headlines growing larger and more sensational with each passing edition. Words like terror and panic and monster were set in thick black type. Artists who had never set foot in the Pine Barrens were commissioned to draw lurid, speculative illustrations of the creature, giving a definitive, terrifying form to the phantom that haunted the public imagination. The journalists were no longer simply reporting on a phenomenon. They were actively shaping it, turning a series of strange events into a grand, terrifying spectacle. They were answering the core question of the panic: how does a legend move faster than the truth? It moves on the wheels of the printing press and over the wires of the telegraph. The narrative was now one of a state under siege, a modern society brought to its knees by a creature from its own folklore. The mass psychosis had reached its zenith. The devil was everywhere because the newspapers had put him there, on every street corner, in every home. As Thursday drew to a close, the atmosphere of crisis among the authorities was reaching a breaking point. Rational explanations had failed. Official reassurances were met with scorn. Their own officers had fired on the creature to no effect. They were losing control, and the public was demanding a resolution. It was in this climate of desperation that a single, electrifying report came in over the telegraph at the Burlington County Police Station. A patrol unit on the western edge of the Pine Barrens, the place where it had all begun, reported a confirmed sighting. The creature had been seen moving low through the trees, heading back into the dark heart of the forest, back to its home. An officer, a man Sergeant Mason knew and trusted, claimed to have it cornered near a frozen swamp. The message was clear. This was their chance. The scattered, chaotic hunt was about to become a focused, desperate chase. A final confrontation was looming, a night pursuit through the frozen, primeval wilderness that had birthed the monster. The report that crackled over the telegraph wire late on that Thursday afternoon was the signal Sergeant James Mason had been waiting for, the one he both desired and dreaded. For days, he had been a collector of phantom evidence, a curator of a growing museum of hysteria. He had documented impossible tracks, interviewed terrified witnesses, and charted a path of chaos on his office map. Now, the phantom had been given a location. It had been seen, cornered, on the western fringe of the Pine Barrens, the vast, primordial wilderness from which it had first emerged. This was the moment the hunt ceased to be a metaphor. It was a chance to confront the source of the terror, to drag the myth into the unforgiving light of a police investigation and put an end to it, one way or another. Sergeant Mason did not delegate. This was his case, his responsibility. He gathered a small unit of his most trusted men, a handful of veteran constables who had seen the worst of human nature but had never been asked to confront the inhuman. They were practical, sober men, armed with standard-issue revolvers and heavy, pump-action shotguns loaded with buckshot, instruments of brutal, close-quarters force. They also brought dogs, 2 seasoned bloodhounds whose reputation for tracking was legendary in the county. The animals whined with eagerness in the back of the transport wagon, their powerful senses unaware that they were about to be put to a test for which their breeding had not prepared them. The plan was simple, a classic pincer movement adapted for a paranormal quarry. They would meet the patrol unit that had made the initial report, and together they would press into the forest, following the tracks, the dogs, and their instincts until they found the source of the state's affliction. They arrived at the edge of the barrens as the last of the weak, gray daylight was failing. The transition from the cleared farmland to the forest was abrupt and profound, like stepping across a border into another country, an older, wilder nation of pitch pine and tangled cedar. The air here was different, heavier, scented with the sharp, resinous perfume of the pines and the damp, cold smell of the frozen earth. A wind was beginning to rise, a low, mournful sigh that whispered through the countless needles of the canopy, a sound that seemed to be the forest's own breathing. It carried with it the first, delicate flurries of snow. The patrol that had made the call was waiting for them, their faces grim, their lanterns already lit and casting long, nervous shadows that danced and writhed at the tree line. Their leader, a Corporal Mason knew to be a reliable man, pointed a gloved finger into the deepening gloom. He reported that the tracks were fresh, less than an hour old, and that the thing had moved into a dense cedar swamp, a place of treacherous footing and near impenetrable darkness. The dogs were released. They hit the ground with a joyful burst of energy, their noses immediately to the snow, and they found the scent almost instantly. They let out a series of deep, baying cries, the sound of the hunt beginning, and plunged into the forest. The officers followed, a small, determined procession of men and swinging lanterns moving into a world of absolute black. The light from their lamps was shockingly inadequate. It carved out small, temporary islands of yellow in an infinite ocean of darkness. It illuminated the trunks of ancient trees, the low-hanging branches that clawed at their faces, and the thick, powdery snow underfoot. Beyond the perimeter of this fragile light, the woods were a solid wall of impenetrable shadow, a place that felt alive and watchful. For the first mile, the chase was a relentless, forward progression. The dogs were confident, pulling hard against their leashes, their baying echoing through the silent woods. The men moved in a tight formation, shotguns held at port arms, their senses on a razor's edge. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind in the branches, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. The snow was beginning to fall more heavily now, a thick, wet curtain that swirled in the beams of their lanterns and muffled the sound of their own progress. The wind was no longer a whisper, it was a shriek, a living voice that seemed to mock their intrusion. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the cold a palpable, biting force that worked its way through their heavy wool coats. They were entering a primal world, a place governed by its own ancient and unforgiving laws, and their modern uniforms and weapons felt like a child's costume in the face of it. Then, the behavior of the dogs began to change. The confident, eager baying faltered, replaced by a series of confused and agitated whines. They began to strain at their leashes, not forward, but sideways, trying to pull away from the trail they had been so eagerly following. One of the bloodhounds, the larger of the two, suddenly stopped dead in its tracks. It planted its feet, lowered its head, and a low, guttural growl began to rumble in its chest. The hair on its back stood up in a rigid, bristling line. The animal was staring into a particularly dark and dense thicket of cedar, and it was trembling, not from the cold, but from a deep and instinctual terror. The handlers tried to urge the dogs forward, but they refused. They pulled backward, their claws digging into the snow, their initial hunting lust completely extinguished and replaced by a desperate, animal need to flee. Sergeant Mason called a halt. The men stood in a circle, their lanterns held high, their shotguns now pointed outward into the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. The wind howled, and the snow was now a blinding, horizontal blizzard. They were deep in the heart of the barrens, miles from any road, and their primary tracking tool, the infallible senses of the hounds, had failed them. They were on their own. It was the junior officer who saw it first. He let out a choked cry and pointed upward. For a brief, terrible moment, the clouds overhead parted, and a sliver of cold white moonlight broke through, illuminating the snow-covered canopy of the forest. And there, silhouetted against the lunar glow, was a shape. It was perched on a thick, high branch of a massive white pine, perhaps 100 feet from where they stood. It was not a bird, and it was not a man. It was something in between, something that violated the known categories of the natural world. Its head was long and slender, unmistakably equine, and it was turned down toward them, as if observing their pathetic circle of light with a kind of detached, alien intelligence. From its hunched back, a pair of immense, membranous wings were partially furled, their leathery texture visible even at this distance. The men could not see its color in the monochromatic moonlight, only its impossible, terrifying form. And then it lifted its head, and from the dark silhouette, 2 points of light ignited, glowing with a soft yet intensely malevolent red fire. The moment of stunned silence was broken by a single, panicked word shouted by one of the men. It was the only word that seemed to fit: devil. That single word was the spark that ignited the powder keg of their fear. There was no order given. There was no coordinated volley. There was only the spontaneous, chaotic eruption of gunfire. The men opened fire with everything they had. The peaceful, snow-filled forest was suddenly ripped apart by a deafening, rolling thunder of shotgun blasts and the sharp, cracking retort of revolvers. Muzzle flashes lit the scene in a series of brilliant, strobing tableaus, each flash burning the creature's silhouette onto their retinas. The sound was immense, a declaration of modern, human violence against the ancient, silent dark. It echoed for miles through the frozen pines, a sound that carried not the confidence of the hunter, but the sheer, panicked terror of the prey. They fired until their weapons were empty, until the clicking of hammers on spent cartridges was the only sound left. A profound, ringing silence descended, broken only by the howling of the wind and the ragged, desperate panting of the men. They stood in a cloud of acrid, blue gun smoke that mingled with the swirling snow, their eyes fixed on the branch where the creature had been. It was gone. There was no sound of it falling through the branches, no cry of pain, no heavy thud of a body hitting the forest floor. It had simply vanished in the fury of their assault. Slowly, cautiously, Sergeant Mason led the men forward, their lanterns held out before them like talismans against the dark. They reloaded their weapons as they walked, the metallic click of shells being chambered a small, reassuring sound in the immense silence. They reached the base of the great pine tree and cast their lights upon the snow. It was pristine. There was no body. There was no blood. There were no feathers, no fur, nothing to indicate that anything had ever been there, except for a handful of shotgun pellets embedded in the bark of the tree, far below the branch where the creature had perched. They had unleashed a hailstorm of lead, enough to fell a dozen men, and it had seemingly vanished into thin air. But then they found the tracks. They started near the base of a different tree, a few yards away. They were the same cloven bipedal prints they had been documenting for days. The men followed them, their hopes for a rational conclusion now completely shattered. The trail led them a short distance to a small, natural clearing in the forest. And there, in the center of the clearing, the tracks stopped. There were 2 final, deep impressions in the snow, pressed down with such force that the frozen earth beneath was visible. And from that point on, there was nothing. Just an unbroken, ever-deepening blanket of white snow stretching out before them. The tracks did not lead away. They led skyward. The officers stood in that clearing for a long time, the blizzard swirling around them, the lantern light catching the infinite, falling flakes. They were a small group of modern men, armed with the best technology of their age, and they had come face to face with a myth. They had hunted it, they had seen it, and they had fired upon it, and in the end, it had simply ascended into the storm and disappeared, leaving them with nothing but an impossible story and a set of tracks that defied the laws of their world. Did they truly see the creature from the legend, a being of flesh and blood and impossible anatomy? Or did the fear and the darkness and the shrieking of the wind conspire to create a shape for their collective dread, a monster born of hysteria? They were the only ones who had been there, the only ones who had seen. And as they began their long, silent, and defeated march back out of the forest, They carried the weight of that question with them, a weight far heavier than their weapons or their exhaustion. The chase was over. The great hunt, the climactic event of a week of terror, had ended not with a capture, but with a quiet and deeply unsettling vanishing. And with its disappearance, a profound and sudden silence began to fall across the state of New Jersey. After the violent, chaotic crescendo of the chase in the pines, there came a silence. It was a quiet so profound and so sudden that it was, in its own way, as unsettling as the shrieks and the sirens that had preceded it. The morning of Friday, January 19th, arrived with a world transformed, buried under a fresh, immaculate blanket of snow. The blizzard had passed in the night, leaving behind a landscape of crystalline beauty, a scene of profound and deceptive peace. The wind was gone, and the sky was a high, clear, and unforgiving blue. And across the entire state of New Jersey, from the haunted heart of the Pine Barrens to the industrial shores of the Delaware River, there were no new sightings. There were no new tracks. The creature, the panic, the terror, it had all vanished as completely as the footprints of the thing that had ascended into the storm. The week of the devil was over. The return to normalcy was a slow, awkward, and deeply strange process. It was like waking from a terrible fever dream, the memory of the delirium still vivid and terrifying, yet clashing with the mundane reality of the morning light. On that Friday, schools did not immediately reopen. The factory whistles remained silent. There was a collective hesitation, a communal holding of the breath, as an entire populace cautiously peered out from behind their locked doors, testing the air, listening for the beat of leathery wings. But the sky remained empty, the silence held. By midday, a tentative trickle of life began to return to the streets. A few shopkeepers unbolted their doors. A handful of wagons ventured out onto the snow-covered roads. People spoke to each other in hushed, subdued tones, their conversations dominated by one subject, their eyes still instinctively scanning the rooftops and the winter sky. They were a people recovering from a shared trauma, and the scars were still fresh. The newspapers, which had been the primary engine of the panic, now became the architects of its dissolution. The very same editors who had printed sensational, lurid headlines just a day before now began a careful and deliberate process of retraction. The Saturday editions were a masterpiece of journalistic backpedaling. The tone shifted from credulous terror to a sober, almost paternalistic skepticism. Experts were suddenly found and quoted at length. A zoologist from Princeton University offered a detailed, if somewhat strained, theory involving a flock of migrating geese, their forms distorted by fog, and their cries amplified by the peculiar acoustics of a winter landscape. A psychologist was given space to write about the phenomenon of collective delusion, of how a shared suggestion can take root in a community and blossom into a mass hallucination. The eyewitness accounts, once presented as unimpeachable fact, were now re-examined and subtly discredited. The witnesses were described as well-meaning but simple country folk, or as excitable city dwellers caught up in the moment. The creature was methodically dismantled, its parts explained away, its whole reduced to a perfect storm of superstition, weather, and fear. It was a necessary act of societal self-preservation. The monster had to be put back into its mythological cage because the alternative, that it was real and could return, was simply too terrifying to contemplate. The week of hysteria was officially rebranded as a moment of collective foolishness, a strange and embarrassing episode to be forgotten as quickly as possible. And so, life began to resume its familiar rhythms. On Monday, January 22nd, 1 week after the first tracks had appeared, the schools reopened. The factories called their workers back, and the comforting, Familiar sounds of industry once again filled the air. The story of the Jersey Devil receded from the front pages, replaced by the more mundane concerns of politics and commerce. The event was becoming what it had been before the third week of January, a piece of folklore, a quaint local legend. But for those who had been at the heart of the storm, forgetting was not so simple. For the trolley conductor, for the factory workers, for the farmer with the scorched patch of earth in his yard, and most of all, for Sergeant James Mason, the silence that followed was filled with the echo of an impossible truth. The week had not vanished for them. It had been seared into their memories. In his office at the Burlington County Police Station, Sergeant Mason sat before a blank incident report, the final, official piece of paperwork that would close the case. The task before him was a monumental one. He was required, by the rigid dictates of his profession, to reduce the surreal, terrifying, and inexplicable events of the past 7 days into the dry, objective language of a police document. He had to build a narrative that was both logical and conclusive, a narrative that would satisfy his superiors and align with the new, officially sanctioned version of events. He had to write a report that was, in essence, a lie. He sat at his desk for hours, the winter light fading outside his window, the pen heavy and inert in his hand. How could he describe the tracks that walked over rooftops and vanished into thin air? How could he explain the terror that had stopped a horse's heart, or the creature that had shrugged off a volley of police bullets? To write the literal truth as he had experienced it would be an act of professional suicide. It would be the end of his career, the ramblings of a man who had succumbed to the very hysteria he was supposed to contain. His final report, which still exists today, buried deep within the state archives, is a testament to his internal conflict. It is a document of careful omissions and deliberate ambiguity. He recorded the initial calls, the discovery of the tracks, and the deployment of his officers. He used phrases like unidentified tracks and prints of an indeterminate origin. He documented the public panic, the closing of the schools and factories, framing it as a textbook case of civil unrest fueled by local superstition. He mentioned the incident at the Camden Ferry House, but described the target of the officer's gunfire as a large, unidentified avian specimen, its form obscured by darkness and industrial smoke. The word creature is never used. The word monster never appears. His account of the final chase in the Pine Barrens was the most difficult part for him to write. He described the tracking of the prints into the cedar swamp. He reported that his officers had discharged their weapons at a shadowy figure glimpsed in the trees during the blizzard, a figure which he suggested was likely a large deer or a bear, its shape distorted by the swirling snow. He concluded that no animal was found, and that the tracks were ultimately lost in the heavy snowfall. The report ends with a concise, professional summary. The panic of January 1909 was the result of a series of misidentified animal sightings, amplified by the local press and a pre-existing folk legend, all of which was exacerbated by a period of severe winter weather. The case, he wrote in the final line, was closed. He signed his name at the bottom of the page, the ink from his fountain pen, a stark, definitive black against the paper. He had done his duty. He had restored order, at least on paper. He had provided the rational explanation that the world required. But as he filed the report away, he felt no sense of victory or relief. He felt only the profound, hollow ache of a man who had been forced to deny the evidence of his own senses. He knew that what he had written was a fiction, a necessary one perhaps, but a fiction nonetheless. The truth was in the details he had left out, the glowing red eyes, the way the tracks had led to the sky, the collective, primal fear he had seen in the eyes of his own men. He had hunted something that week, and it was not a flock of geese. He had looked into the face of an ancient mystery, and it had left him permanently changed, a man forever haunted by the gap between the world as it was supposed to be and the world as he had, for 7 terrifying days, known it to be. Decades passed. The world moved on, hurtling through wars and inventions and the relentless march of progress. The gaslights of Camden were replaced by the steady, sterile glare of electric street lamps. The story of the 1909 panic became a historical curiosity, a footnote in the state's official history. Sergeant Mason retired, a respected but quietly melancholic figure, known in his later years for his habit of sitting on his porch on cold January nights, his gaze fixed on the dark line of the distant pines. He rarely spoke of that week, but those who knew him understood that he had never truly closed the case. The legend of the Jersey Devil endured, as legends do, becoming a part of the cultural inheritance of the region, a story told to scare tourists and children, a brand for sports teams and craft beers. It was a myth, safely contained in the past. But the past is never truly past. Folklore, at its heart, is the memory of a thing that was once believed to be real, and sometimes that memory is stirred. Years after Sergeant Mason had passed away, on another cold and quiet January morning, after a heavy, overnight snow, a young boy cutting through the woods on his way to school, not far from the very spot where the first tracks had been found, noticed something strange in the snow. They were large, cloven prints. They moved on 2 legs, and they led from the dark heart of the pines toward the sleeping towns. It lasted 7 days, but some swore it never ended. The case file on the panic of 1909 is now closed. Our work here is a testament to the idea that some stories refuse to be forgotten, and that the past is a living, breathing entity. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand with us when the next file is opened, and leave your own thoughts in the comments on what you have witnessed here.